Have you ever felt like silence is listening to you? I'm not talking about that ordinary silence, the kind you find in an empty room or on a quiet morning. I'm talking about a silence that pulses, that breathes, that carries voices you've never heard, but that seem to know exactly who you are. That's what I found when I stepped foot in the Santa Aurea Rehabilitation Clinic, a place that promised healing and delivered disappearance. Patients would begin to recover, and then out of nowhere, they'd disappear. No trace, no goodbyes. All they left behind were strange phrases, recurring dreams, and a pattern no one seemed to want to see. But I saw and listened, because to understand what happens when silence speaks, you have to be willing to hear what no one else wants to hear. This wasn't just another investigation. It was a journey, a dive into something that to this day, I don't know if it began inside the clinic or inside me. What I found down there still resonates, even now. And before I tell you everything I experienced, I need to know, where are you watching me from? Maybe I've already seen a case somewhere. That morning, the phone rang with an urgency I was already familiar with. On the other end, a trembling voice from the health department whispered an unproblematic plea for help. Patients disappearing without a trace. The name of the clinic sounded strange, but the address didn't. It was the same property where, years ago, I had investigated a case of attempted mass suicide that was never officially closed. I grabbed my notes, committed the address to memory, and set off. Along the way, something nagged at me, a sense of déjà vu, as if I already knew what I was about to find. The road there was winding, surrounded by tall, dense trees that seemed to block the path behind me. The closer I got to the mansion, the thicker the air seemed, charged with an uneasy silence. It was as if the place was waiting for me, and not with good intentions. The clinic loomed imposingly before my eyes, an old mansion restored with a certain architectural flair, but with an empty soul. Tall windows, tinted glass, a facade too bright to hide what was happening inside. There was a stark contrast between what was shown and what seemed to be avoided at all costs. It was the kind of building that tries to feel like a home, but carries the coldness of a poorly disguised mental hospital. Even before knocking on the door, I felt that shiver down my neck that only appears when I'm about to enter something big or dangerous. The kind of case that demands more than logic, that makes you question everything, even your own mind. I didn't know it yet, but this investigation wouldn't just ask me for evidence. It would ask me for silence, and to listen to what lives inside. The sound of my own breathing was the only noise that accompanied me as I crossed the lobby. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, as if protesting my presence. Ahead of me, a narrow hallway stretched longer than it should. Its doors lined as if they were keeping watch. The windows, tall and covered by thick curtains, let in only a filtered, almost sad light. And there was that silence, not the usual silence, but one that seemed to contain voices that had given up speaking. As I walked, something inside me recoiled. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched, even though no one was around. I looked back 3 times before reaching the reception desk, trying to understand why my body kept telling me something was wrong. The receptionist, pale and evasive, avoided eye contact, as if carrying a secret too big for her shoulders. She smiled without smiling. The clinic's walls were decorated with neutral paintings, nature photos, and motivational quotes that seemed out of place. Everything there was an attempt to appear peaceful, but every detail betrayed this effort. It was as if the environment had been created by someone who knew what normal was, but didn't feel what it meant. It made me uneasy, as if everything there was a poorly constructed simulation of sanity. I walked up one of the hallways to see the patients' rooms, and the further I walked, the more I noticed the doors were locked from the outside. This wasn't rehabilitation, it was containment. It wasn't about protecting the patients from the outside world, but perhaps about protecting the world from what was inside those rooms. And somewhere within those walls, I felt a presence, not human, not physical, but real enough to chill my blood. Dr. Alankar appeared at the end of the hallway like an elegant shadow, tall, thin, with a meticulously trimmed beard and thin-framed glasses. His voice sounded far too calm for someone in the midst of a crisis. He greeted me with a firm handshake, but his gaze didn't match. He guided me to his office, saying he understood my concern, but that everything was under control. A phrase that, said in that tone, sounded more like a warning than a reassurance. The principal's office was impeccable. Minimalist, cold, without a single personal item in sight. Just diplomas on the wall and a spiral-shaped metal sculpture on the desk, slowly rotating, as if hypnotizing. "Katherine," he said, "these people are fragile. Sometimes they disappear because they want to disappear. They run away from themselves." His speech was practiced, technical, convincing, but I sensed it. He knew more than he was saying. I asked about the security cameras, the night surveillance, the medical records of the missing. He dodged with calculated answers, never denying anything, but also never revealing anything useful. "We're dealing with relapses. It's sad, but predictable." His calm was rehearsed, too perfect to be real. When I mentioned that all the missing people were in the same stage of treatment, he smiled and changed the subject. As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Alencar wasn't there to heal anyone. He observed, he studied, he controlled. He was like an invisible conductor, conducting a silent symphony, where each missing note was part of a larger composition, and yet something told me he wasn't the only conductor in that orchestra. I began to cross-reference the records of the missing, one by one, like someone piecing together an invisible puzzle. Men and women between 25 and 40, all in the final stages of treatment, about to be discharged. Their progress was described as remarkable, consistent, almost complete. But then, as if on cue, they all vanished silently. No trace, no sign of a struggle, no baggage. They vanished from everyday life as if they had never existed. One specific detail caught my attention in the reports. Before they disappeared, the patients began reporting auditory episodes during the night. Voices, murmurs coming from inside the walls or ceiling. One patient said she heard her own name whispered at the foot of her bed. Another said the voice asked if she was ready to go back. Go back to where? And with whom? The strangest thing was that these reports were recorded in the medical records as residual delusions, typical of the transitional phase. But none of the other patients had these symptoms in the earlier stages. It was as if the disappearance began inside their heads, like a subtle invasion of the mind, before materializing in the body. Was this a clue, or just part of the breakdown? I've seen a lot of things in psychiatric institutions. I've seen people hiding from their own minds, others freeing themselves from them. But this story was different. The voices didn't seem delirious. They seemed like an invitation. What if they really were? What if, in that deep silence of the clinic, someone or something was actually calling? I sat with the few patients still at the clinic. Some were hesitant to speak, as if the mere act of naming it made them more vulnerable. But it took only gaining the trust of two of them to realize there was something bigger behind their disappearances. They weren't just hearing voices, they were dreaming about them. And most disturbingly, they all described the same scenario. A figure standing outside their room, whispering through the doorway. The words changed little. It was always something like, "Return to silence," or "It's safe here." The tone of the voices was calm, almost comforting, which made me wonder, what if these voices weren't threatening? What if, for them, they were a form of relief? A patient named Raphael, with deep-set eyes and a low voice, told me that when he heard the voice, his fear disappeared. It was as if someone understood me without me having to explain anything. Another patient, Laura, cried as she recounted the dream. She said that for the first time, she felt someone calling her name without judgment, and that the room ceased to exist. The hallway disappeared. She saw only light and silence. When I asked if she wanted to leave with that voice, she simply replied, "I don't know if it's a place or a state." It chilled me to the core, because somehow I understood what she meant. I left these interviews with more questions than answers, but with one uncomfortable certainty. The disappearances weren't violent. They were almost voluntary, as if something or someone was offering the patients exactly what they craved most: peace, silence. But at what cost? I returned to the empty rooms, the ones where the patients had disappeared. I wanted to observe what the staff's hurried eyes might have overlooked. In one of them, room 14, I smelled the scent of freshly applied disinfectant, trying to cover up something older, something ingrained. I rummaged through the mattress, the corners of the bed, the crevices in the baseboard, and it was there, between the bed frame and the wall, that I found a badly torn piece of notebook, folded in half, almost invisible. I unfolded the paper carefully. The words were handwritten tightly. Some phrases seemed like the drafts of broken thoughts. Silence is the medicine. They hear what they shouldn't. There's someone in the walls. On the back of the paper, a sequence of lines forming circles, perhaps symbols, perhaps just delirium. But something there seemed purposeful, as if someone wanted to be found. The handwriting was shaky, but repetitive, insistent. It was clear the writer was trying to convey something urgent before disappearing. The phrase, "silence hurts less when it talks to you," particularly disturbed me. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was imbued with lived truth. I went back to searching other rooms and under patient Raphael's bed, found a phrase carved with a pocket knife. "Coming back hurts more than staying." It was as if each missing person had left behind little fragments of themselves, not as clues, but as goodbyes. Messages that didn't beg for help, but warned. They knew. They knew they were leaving. And most disturbingly, they seemed at peace with it. In my profession, I've learned to be wary of places with a past that's too revamped, so I began to thoroughly research the property's origins. An afternoon in the public archives was enough to confirm what I already suspected. The building wasn't originally a rehabilitation clinic. In the 1970s, it operated as a state-run sanatorium, one of those that history has tried to hide. And worst of all, it was a reference point for a specific type of experiment: extreme sensory deprivation. Old reports mentioned patients spending days locked in soundproof rooms, without light or stimulation of any kind. The justification? Reduction of internal voices due to psychic exhaustion, a method that today would be considered inhumane, but at the time, it was considered cutting-edge science. Several names associated with that place have disappeared from official records, including a doctor named Alan Carr, grandfather of the current director. The documents were incomplete and redacted, but the descriptions matched. Patients reporting auditory hallucinations, catatonic behavior, a desire to not return to human society. The pattern was eerily similar to what I saw in the current clinic. It was as if no time had passed, as if the experiment were somehow still ongoing, disguised as modern treatment. I returned to the clinic with these files in my bag and a certainty latent in my throat. This place was designed to silence people, literally. And if the methods were the same, perhaps the missing hadn't simply vanished, but had been driven to the same void where so many others had been left before them. When a case starts to replay in my head even after hours, it's a sign that something big is about to surface. And it did. A former employee of the clinic, now on leave for psychiatric reasons, approached me anonymously. His hands were shaking and his eyes were watering. He said he didn't want to get involved, but that he couldn't bear the weight of what he knew anymore. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, old cassette tape wrapped in duct tape. "Listen, but just once," he said, and left without looking back. It took me a few days to gather the courage to play the recording. I used an old portable recorder I'd kept since my first cases. At first, there was just noise. A low, constant hiss, like a distant air conditioner. Then, little by little, something began to form. Voices. Many. Overlapping, indistinct. A woman was crying. A man was mumbling garbled phrases. And amidst this chaos, a clear, almost intimate whisper hissed my own name. Katherine. I immediately paused the recording, my heart racing. I played it again, and nothing. The clip seemed to have disappeared, as if it had never existed. But I knew what I had heard. I rewound it several times and noticed something else. In the background of the recording, a rhythmic noise, like a heartbeat. Too human to be random. Maybe someone was recording from inside one of the deprivation rooms. I kept the tape in a sealed box and wrote it all down. That night, I dreamed of the sounds again. I woke with the feeling of being watched or listened to. That's when I began to wonder. What if silence isn't the absence of sound, but what remains after the sound is gone? At first, I thought it was just fatigue. After all, Working with disappearances means carrying the absence of others on your shoulders. But the dreams began to come with disturbing frequency. Always the same scenario. Me inside the clinic, alone, walking through corridors that stretched on forever. Far away, a voice called me, calm, deep, familiar. And in the dream, unlike in real life, I answered, without hesitation. I always woke up at the same time, 3:13 a.m. My heart was racing, my sheets were soaked with sweat. Throughout the day, I began to notice interference in my equipment, crackling in the audio, and glitches in the recordings. Distorted voices would appear in sections that should have been silent. My rational mind told me it was coincidence, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I was being drawn into this case, and not just as an investigator. I told this to a trusted colleague who suggested taking a break. But how can you take a break when something follows you, even in silence? I started avoiding mirrors. I stopped listening to music. My world was getting quieter. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the kind of silence that seems to hold a sound about to explode. A sound that only I seemed to be able to hear. It was at that point that I understood. The case was no longer just about the patients. It was also about me. About what this silence triggered within me. Fears I'd buried, questions I'd never asked. What if somehow I too was vulnerable? What if I was the next to hear the call? One early morning, I decided to do what I always promise myself I won't do. Cross the line between protocol and instinct. I waited for the night shift, when the hallways are asleep, and entered Dr. Alencar's office. The lock gave way too easily, almost as if someone wanted me in. The dimness of the room was cut only by the cold light of a lamp on the desk. Stacks of reports, clinical files, and beneath a carefully misaligned pile, a black-covered notebook labeled A. Alencar. I leafed through the diary with the attention of someone wielding dynamite. The first few pages described clinical studies, technical terminology, and partial results. But soon the notes changed tone. He spoke of so-called absolute silence sessions, an experimental method that promised to eliminate emotional pain by erasing the mental noise of guilt and fear. According to him, silence healed by absence, a state where trauma ceased to echo because it simply ceased to exist. Or, in his words, the sound of healing is the sound of nothing. But the more I read, the darker the text became. The final pages described side effects, psychotic episodes, dissociation, patients unable to recognize their own voices. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others said they heard the echo of a place without an echo. Dr. Alencar didn't seem remorseful. He seemed fascinated. He wrote as if he were getting closer and closer to discovering something unnameable. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling. On the spine, a faded inscription. Repeat, perfect, continue. I understood then that the voices the patients heard might not be symptoms, they were residue. Echoes of an experiment that never ended. And perhaps the doctor was simply improving what his grandfather had started. With the diary in hand and the interviews annotated, I began to piece together the puzzle from a different perspective. What if the voices the patients heard weren't just hallucinations? What if they were connected to something real, yet invisible to conventional psychiatric methods? I compared the reports with old cases of sensory deprivation and discovered a curious pattern. The less external stimulus, the more intense the internal manifestation. As if the silence weren't empty, but a channel. I sought out experts in neuroscience and psychoanalysis. One researcher told me that the brain, deprived of stimuli, tends to fill in the blanks with repressed memories, unresolved traumas, and even voices representing authority figures. But this didn't explain why the patients' voices were so similar. The repetition of phrases, the same calm intonation, the same sense of familiarity. It wasn't the kind of hallucination one expects from fragmented minds. What intrigued me most was the patients' reactions. None of them showed any real fear of the voices. On the contrary, some seemed to expect them, as if someone had finally been able to hear their pain without judgment. I began to suspect that perhaps these voices weren't created, but summoned. Brought to the surface by a process Dr. Alencar knew well, and which he had been carefully replicating. The question that wouldn't leave my mind was simple and frightening. What happens when someone hears a voice that shouldn't exist, and yet it responds? His name was Oswaldo, He'd been at the clinic longer than any other patient, almost a piece of furniture. When I asked about him, the nurse hesitated. "He hasn't spoken to anyone in years," she said. But something inside me persisted. I found Oswaldo sitting in the inner garden, his eyes lost in the horizon that only he seemed to see. I sat beside him, saying nothing. Sometimes silence draws more attention than any question. After a few minutes, he spoke. Without looking at me, his voice low, as if repeating something he'd said many times before and never been heard. The voices weren't in my head. They came from the speakers, those little speakers in the corners of the rooms. They said it was ambient sound, relaxing music. But at night, it changed. I remained silent. He continued. We could hear it, but not them, only us, as if it were for us. I asked for more details, but he started to get agitated. He said he didn't want to go back there, that when he closed his eyes, he could still hear them. Soft voices, repeating phrases. "It's okay now. You can rest now. Silence is your home." I got up to leave and he grabbed my arm. "They don't want us to leave, Katherine. They really hear us." The way he said my name, it gave me chills. That conversation turned a corner. If the voices were indeed coming from the speakers, then someone or something was programming them with intention. They weren't echoes, they were messages. Targeted, precise, intimate. But the strangest thing? When I examined the speakers in the rooms, they were gone. Oswaldo had mentioned that downstairs the voices were louder. I kept this in mind for days, until I noticed something strange on the building's original architectural map. A basement corridor was listed in the old records, but not on the current plans. I followed the musty smell coming from a metal door at the back of the laundry room, disguised as a pantry. With some force, the lock gave way. The concrete staircase plunged into a thick, damp darkness, as if the building itself had an emotional basement. I descended with a small flashlight and my heart racing. With each step, the air grew denser. The sound of the clinic faded completely, as if I'd crossed an invisible threshold. At the end of the corridor, a heavy door. I opened it, and there it was, the underground laboratory. Rooms lined with soundproofing material, sensory deprivation booths, chairs with metal supports, and ancient headphones connected to equipment that still blinked. I touched one of the buttons and heard a subtle click. Inside one of the booths, a sound system activated by itself. A deep hum filled the space, and for a second I swear I heard someone breathing. It was as if the place had woken up. Files were stacked high, with handwritten notes and recent dates. The experiments were not only back on, they were underway. Methodically, with planning, with patience. The most terrifying thing was realizing that some of the names in the reports were the same as those on the missing persons list. Everyone went through these sessions before disappearing, and there, under the dim light of that basement, I felt I had found the heart of the mystery. But even so, something told me this wasn't the end. It was just the surface of what was buried beneath. I spent days cross-referencing data, documents, and reports until everything fit together, painfully. The names on the basement reports, the session times, the hidden recordings, everything pointed to the same person responsible. Dr. Alencar not only knew about the experiments, he was the current conductor. He was repeating, perhaps perfecting, his grandfather's same dark protocol. Only now with modern language under the guise of therapeutic silent treatment, approved by coldly constructed reports. In the hidden records, I read phrases like positive response to total shutdown and successful gradual elimination of internal noise. In clinical terms, it sounded clear. But in practice, it meant patients were being silenced from the inside out, not with medication, but with extreme sensory isolation, programmed auditory stimulation, and emotional manipulation. They weren't hearing mind voices. They were being exposed to specific, repetitive sounds until their very identity dissolved into silence. Worse, the disappearances weren't security breaches, as the doctor claimed. They were phases of the experiment. When the patient reached the point of no return, they were removed from society and from the system. No discharge records, no transfers. They vanished, as if they'd never existed. I began to understand that the goal wasn't to heal the trauma, it was to erase everything that could generate pain, doubt, or emotional noise. A kind of euthanasia of the soul. I saw with my own eyes the names precisely scratched out, each marked with a symbol next to it. The same symbol engraved on the laboratory walls. That was it. Dr. Alencar didn't just want to silence his patients' voices. He wanted to create empty beings, human cocoons, soundless vessels. But what he would do with this absolute silence was still a mystery. I waited for the right moment. Dr. Alencar was alone in the clinic garden. As he did every Wednesday, at precisely 5 p.m., I approached him bluntly, with the diary in one hand and the tape in the other. He showed no surprise. He just smiled slightly, as if he'd already expected to be discovered. "So you finally listened," he said, before I could say anything. That froze me for a second. It wasn't a confession. It was an invitation. I began to question him directly, bluntly. The patients, experiments, the hidden sessions. He listened to everything silently, as if analyzing the intonation, not the words. When I finished, he sighed deeply and said, "Katherine, the voices never came from the speakers. We simply awakened them." According to him, the profound silence didn't reveal a void, but rather opened space for something more ancient, something that lives within us all, the collective unconscious. He spoke with a gleam in his eyes, like a weary prophet. He said that voices are fragments of human pain that no one wants to hear, and that when the external noise fades, they return to demand attention. "It's not the sound that scares you, Katherine. It's what it reveals." And then with disturbing serenity, he added, "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" That wasn't a question. It was an observation. For a moment, I couldn't answer, because it was true. Ever since I'd entered that clinic, something inside me had been changing. My dreams, my thoughts, even the way silence affected me. It was as if an invisible field was expanding inside me, echoing the same emptiness the patients described. What if Dr. Alencar was right? What if what we hear is what we've been trying to forget our entire lives? That night, something changed. The atmosphere in the clinic grew heavier, as if the air had thickened. The lights began to flicker in sequence, as if a short circuit were running through the entire building. I went to the main hallway, and there, at the end, I saw one of the doors ajar. A low, almost imperceptible sound echoed from within. It wasn't a scream, nor a wail. It was my name, whispered carefully, as if someone knew me deeply. I walked toward the sound with the caution of someone treading on delicate memorials. Each step increased the noise, and it wasn't just my name. Other words emerged, jumbled, phrases I'd heard from victims in old cases, voices of people I no longer see, traumas I thought I'd left behind. But now they were there, all of them, speaking to me, inside my head, like a mob organized by fear. I leaned against the wall. Dizzy, I closed my eyes for a second and found myself somewhere else. A dark space, without a ceiling, without a floor, without an echo, only sound. And the voices now didn't whisper, they sang, in unison, as if they were part of something larger. A living structure made of memories, pain, and unresolved silences. I felt my body float, as if my identity were dissolving in the same process the patients endured. The difference? I still knew I was real. I came to, my face pressed against the cold hallway floor. The lights had returned to normal. The sound had disappeared, but inside me, I was still vibrating, as if I'd passed through a portal that could never be undone. And that's when I realized the case was no longer an investigation. Now, it was an experiment, and I no longer knew which side of the line I was on. The next morning, I went straight to Dr. Alencar's office. The room was empty. Not empty of people, empty of everything. His desk, files, computer, books, even the armchair where he usually sat, were gone, as if he had never occupied the space. I called one of the nurses, and her expression upon seeing the emptiness was one of complete shock. She trembled. "He was here yesterday," she stammered. "But no one has seen him since, not even on the cameras, which, incidentally, mysteriously stopped recording at 3:13 a.m. I went straight to the administration office in search of the medical records, files, any documentary trail of the missing patients. Nothing. The system had been reset, the files deleted, the backups gone. Even the external cameras were empty, no entry or exit logs. The clinic had been cleaned. Cleaned inside. The only evidence of what happened there was in my memory, in my notes, and on a single tape tucked away at the bottom of my backpack. The authorities who arrived later treated the case with skepticism. They tried to turn it into a protocol error, an administrative failure, or a dereliction of duty. A final report was issued days later with an absurd conclusion: lack of evidence to justify legal intervention. It was as if the system had been programmed to swallow the entire truth along with the doctor's disappearance. A literal and symbolic disappearance. As if he had dissolved into the very silence he so ardently defended. And it was at that moment that I realized, maybe this had always been the plan. Not to run, not to hide, but to disappear so completely that no one could find you anymore, not even you. Total silence, definite absence, erasure. The official report arrived in a discreet envelope, without the agency's stamp. Archived, classified as a collective episode of psychic hysteria, in an environment of high emotional sensitivity. Basically, they said it was all in our heads. No conclusive evidence, no criminal liability. The kind of closure that suffocates more than it soothes. I stared at those pages as one stares at a lie printed on letterhead. The truth was there, hidden in what was unsaid. The clinic continued operating for a few more weeks. Services were reduced. The atmosphere was tense, until a new board took over, and with it came the promise of a complete restructuring. They painted the walls, replaced the furniture, and created a new website with a modern slogan. But I knew, the soul of the place remained intact, untouched, invisible, like a hidden archive waiting to be opened by the boldest. Even after I left, I felt that presence with me, sometimes in the silence between one question and the next, sometimes in the minutes before sleep, when everything is quieter than it should be, and when the silence is too deep, it carries weight, volume, vibration, as if there was still someone or something on the other side waiting to be heard. I didn't forget, I couldn't, because there are places that don't let you leave completely. Even when you walk away, your mind lingers. It keeps trying to understand what happened. It keeps echoing voices no one else hears. And in that place, where everyone wanted to be healed by silence, perhaps what was hidden there was precisely what no one had the courage to listen to. 3 days after the official closure, just as I was trying to get back to my routine, I found a manila envelope slipped under my door. No return address, just my handwritten name, in a handwriting too firm to be casual. Inside, a single cassette tape, the same brand, the same model as the one I'd received from the former employee. Only this time, the affixed label read, "Final." My heart raced. I shouldn't have heard it, but of course I did. I turned on the recorder and waited for the familiar hiss to fill the room. For the first few seconds, silence. Then, footsteps. And a breath. My own. I recognized the rhythm, the slight click of my tongue when I tense up. Then came the voice, clear, firm, unmistakable. My own voice, saying, "I heard them first." I replayed the passage over and over, trying to find cuts, flaws, edits. But there was nothing. It was authentic, real, inexplicable. I froze. I'd never recorded that phrase, never. But the tone, the timbre, the slight tremor between the words, it was undeniably mine. I played the tape back, again and again, until I realized there was something subtle beneath the main sound. Murmurs, several voices, almost like a chorus, repeating the phrase along with me. Louder and louder, until the hiss overwhelmed everything. And then, silence. That same silence I'd learned to fear. I turned off the recorder and realized something even more disturbing. The tape was no longer in the machine. It was gone. It vanished before my eyes, as if it had never existed. All that remained was the echo of my own voice in my head. I heard them first, and for a moment, I wondered, was it me who investigated them, or was it me who first responded to the call? Since then, silence has never been the same. It stopped being absence, it became presence. No matter where I am, an empty elevator, a radio-depleted road, or that moment between two sentences, there's always something there. An almost sound, a shiver, a call. And no matter how much I try to rationalize, catalog, name, the truth is, there are things the mind understands, but reason refuses to accept. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear someone calling my name, not aloud. It's always a whisper, bridging the gap between reality and imagination. They call me by name, as if they know not only who I am, but who I was, and who I can become if I answer. At these times, I open my eyes and stare at the ceiling. Nothing, just the muffled sound of my own breathing trying to maintain control. I don't tell anyone about this, not like I just told you, but I confess, sometimes I come close to answering, to saying yes to that call. Because there's something in the voices that stirs something deep inside me. A sense of belonging, as if there were something waiting in the silence. But then I remember the faces that disappeared, and I take a deep breath. In the end, perhaps the question was never where the voices come from, but why some people choose to listen to them. And if you've ever heard your name being called out in the silence, then maybe this story isn't just mine. Maybe the next step now is yours. The mysteries we investigate aren't always outside. Sometimes they live where we least expect them, deep within our minds, amid unresolved memories, or in the silence we try to avoid. What I experienced in that clinic made me realize that the absence of sound can say more than any scream, and that truly listening requires courage, because not everyone is ready to hear what comes from within. This story wasn't just about disappearances. It was about the boundary between the real and the invisible, about the voices we ignore every day, our own, others, the world's. How many times have you silenced something you should have heard? Or ignored that hunch, that call that seemed to come from nowhere? Sometimes, what we call madness is just too much truth compressed into too small a space. If there's one thing I've learned from this case, it's that not everyone who disappears wants to be found. And that silence, when not confronted, will find other ways to be heard. The question is, when yours comes, will you be able to listen? If this investigation touched you in any way, if any part of it resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's still so much I have to tell you, and you never know when you might be the next one to hear something no one else has heard.